Hello. In the last two lectures, we've been looking at how the adult brain is organized. And we looked from the external surface of the brain and saw that it's organized into 5 different distinct areas. We also saw that if you cut up any of these areas and looked at it, stained it for the cell groups or for the axons, that each one of these areas of the brain is very, very complicated. Now, to complicate this picture even more, we looked at just single sections of the brain. These are about 10 microns thick. And each of these subdivisions is inches thick. And so every single part of the brain is complexly organized, and so the internal structure is part of where that complexity arises from. What we also defined a nucleus as a specific area within these different subdivisions. So the superior colliculus was a specific nucleus within the midbrain. The lateral geniculate nucleus was a specific nucleus located in the diencephalon, specifically in the thalamus of the diencephalon. So there are huge numbers of individual structures in the brain. That's really the point that I want to make. And this is part of why it's been so complex and difficult to understand. Each nucleus in the brain, each structure like the superior colliculus, like the lateral geniculate, has its own unique organization, and we call that the cytoarchitecture. And what that means is each nucleus is made up of specific kinds of neurons that are organized in that nucleus in a particular way. And every nucleus, the neurons, are connected to other neurons very specifically. And each nucleus will have different connections. And last of all, each of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of areas of the brain each have a unique function. So this is what we want to talk about now, and that is in general terms how we organize the brain in terms of function. So research has revealed that all these hundreds of nuclei in the brain can be grouped into functional systems. And this is good because I don't know how we'd ever figure out anything if it didn't turn out that way. So we have 2 different kinds of functional systems in the brain. The first kind of functional system is a system with a single unifying function. And this is probably the one that's easiest to appreciate or to understand. And I'm going to give 2 examples. There are many examples I could give. I'm just giving 2. The first is the motor system. So the motor system basically consists of any nucleus or area of the brain or the spinal cord, any area of the nervous system that is involved with motor function. So, for example, we have a number of different things that go into our being able to make a normal motor movement. For example, the brain has to plan the movement. It doesn't just make it. It has to plan it first. So the brain plans a movement. Well, it turns out that if I turn my brain like this, I know that areas located approximately here in the cortex are specifically involved in planning a motor movement. The neurons in these areas actually fire before a movement is initiated. Now, where those neurons get their input, this is one of the mysteries of modern neuroscience. The point is that this area of the brain is involved in the planning of motor movement. If I go just slightly caudal to that, this is the front of the brain, this is the back. If I go just slightly caudal to that, the area of the brain that I now have my fingers on is involved specifically in the initiation of a motor movement. So these neurons will be connected to these neurons. They will plan the movement. This part of the brain will initiate it. Now that's interesting. Now, in order for motor movements to take place, we have to stimulate a number of areas. We also have to inhibit a lot of things. So every time I make a movement, I both contract muscle and inhibit other muscles. There are also motor programs. For example, if I were to walk normally, my arms swing at my side in a very particular way. This is a motor program. Well, that specific function is controlled by nuclei which are deep in this hemisphere that we can't see, that we'll learn about later. But the point is that that's what the function, these nuclei are involved specifically in that function. Now, we talked about this before. In order to make a movement, we have to, if it's going to be coordinated, we have to draw our cerebellum into this. So the cerebellum's involved in being able to coordinate fine, skilled motor movement. So my point here is that just up here, we have a number of different areas, a number of different nuclei that play a role specifically in motor behavior. Now, that we haven't even gotten to the spinal cord yet, but obviously it's spinal cord neurons that actually go out to the muscle. So those neurons that are located in the spinal cord that actually send their processes out to the muscle are also part of the motor system. So it's the coordination of all of these different nuclei in the brain that are all complexly interconnected with each other that allows me to do that. A very fine, skilled motor movement that was planned, initiated, done, and coordinated very quickly. And we have no feel that this is going on in our brains all the time. So it's the reason why we can chew gum and walk at the same time, because our brain can handle more than one thing at a time. We can speak and move our bodies. I can move my hands and speak at the same time. Speech being highly complex, but also a motor function. So all of these areas of the brain that coordinate our motor movement and initiate it and planning of it would all be part of a motor system. Another example of a system with a single unifying function would be the visual system. So let's take that one for example. Here's the front of our brain. So there's our eye, part of the eye is actually an outgrowth of the diencephalon. So the eyeball is one of the only areas, in fact, the only area of the body, where when the doctor looks in your eye, he can see the back of the eye, and that back of the eye is actually an outgrowth of the brain. So it's the only place in the body where you can see a part of the central nervous system in the living person. So the eye is going to be connected to the lateral geniculate and the superior colliculus and many other nuclei. And then the lateral geniculate is going to project right back here to this cortical area. And that will be the first cortical area that processes information about vision and begins the process of the cortex and the brain forming a percept that we call seeing. You don't see with your eye, you see with your brain. If I turn the brain like this and we look at the lateral surface, we're going to learn that a huge number of areas on this lateral surface, our cortex, are devoted, in fact, to vision. And every single one of these areas, from the neural part of our eye to our brain to our cortex, would be examples of nuclei and areas that are involved in the visual system. Now, we also have systems that don't really revolve around a single function, but they're systems that have a variety of related functions. So this is another way that the brain is organized. So for example, the hypothalamus. Our hypothalamus is again in the diencephalon, the ventral portion of the diencephalon, and the hypothalamus is made up of a number of different nuclei that have very, very different functions. But they're related in a sense because most of them are all about establishing homeostasis. So for example, when we're thirsty and drink something, it's because our hypothalamus has motivated us towards restoring a balance in our body because we need the fluid. When we're hungry, we eat. And it's our hypothalamus that tells us we're hungry. And it's also the hypothalamus that will tell us when we're full. So it is attempting to restore that homeostasis. In the example I used earlier, when our temperature goes up or down, away from normal, it's the hypothalamus that will attempt to regulate it and bring it back to where it ought to be. So while all of these functions are so different, they have something in common that makes them part of a system. Another example of a system in the brain is one that's going to be the topic of many lectures in this course, and this is called the limbic system. And limbic means on the edge, on the border. And it got its name because a number of the structures that are located on this edge of the brain, this medial surface of the brain, were found to be part of a sort of system that had something to do with learning, memory, and emotion. And so we're going to be talking about all of the different nuclei. Now let's think about that for a second. The reason it's not a single system with a single unifying function is because learning, memory, emotion, and also executive function are really very different functions. But it's really all one system because, in fact, learning means that you have memory of something. That's what it means to learn it. And we now know that emotions play a role in learning. We also know that emotions play a role in executive function. So now we call this whole group of nuclei, of which there's hundreds, the limbic system. So within a system that's large like that, there might be subsystems that are involved, for example, in learning and memory. There might be other subsystems that are involved in a larger system like the limbic system. Now, another system that we have, and this will be our last example, but it certainly won't be the last example in the class of a system, is going to be the reticular formation. And the reticular formation is another term that has these historical reasons behind the term. It's a small area that's located in the core of the brain. So if we looked inside this structure, sort of in the middle of it, and it extends from the upper medulla all the way into the telencephalon, is this core area, which is called the reticular formation. And it got its name because early neuroanatomists believed that all of the cells were interconnected like a reticulum or a net. And they weren't really. They were individual nerve cells. But these early neuroanatomists couldn't tell that. So they called this area the reticular formation. Modern neuroscience has discovered that there's over 110 individual nuclei in the reticular formation that control everything from your heart rate, your breathing, to consciousness. If there is damage to the reticular formation, particular nuclei in the reticular formation, you are not conscious. And so this area of the brain has many different functions, but it's still in one system referred to as the reticular formation. The reticular formation, by the way, is one of the very, very oldest areas of the brain. So I want to, again, this is very important because this is conceptually how the brain is organized, and it's extremely important that we understand this. When a scientist wants to know what a particular area of the brain does, they want to be able to, first of all, identify the nucleus. They want to identify where it's connected or what it's connected to, what areas of the brain. And they want to know what system it's involved in. So this basic idea that the brain consists of a number of different systems is very fundamental. So our examples were motor system. Any nuclear areas involved in the motor system would be part of that system, motor behavior. We have the visual system. Any nuclear areas that have to do with vision would be included in this. And last of all, we have systems that have a broad variety of functions, but they're all included in particular systems like the hypothalamus, the limbic system, and the reticular formation. And within these large type of systems, we might have a number of subsystems, okay, that are separated out. This has some heuristic value because it's one of the most important things that we want to understand is how the brain is connected, how different nuclei are connected. And I want you to just think about the daunting task that is. Hundreds and hundreds of nuclei, all with individual functions, and we're trying to discover what those are. Now, these different systems and the nuclei are the gray matter of the brain. So remember that the gray matter are the nuclei of the brain. And this is how we subdivide these nuclear groups into these systems. We can also take the axons in the brain, which are the processes that go out to other neurons, and we can classify those. So let's look again at our generic neuron. So these are the dendritic trees up here. This is the neuron cell body and our dendritic trees of our generic neuron. And then there are axons. Now, the neurons, the cell bodies, the nuclei, those neurons stay wherever they're at in the brain. The lateral geniculate, the neurons are in the lateral geniculate. They never move. They never go out of there. It will be the axon out of a neuron in the lateral geniculate that will send its axon up to visual cortex, again, to start that process of the formation of a percept. So we actually classify axons not so much by the system they're associated with, but by another property. And that is related to their general function. So let's review a couple of the general functions and how we look at axons. So axons make up the white matter in the brain. They make up the pathways or tracks in the brain. So when we have bundles of axons which run together, in the peripheral nervous system we call them nerves, and in the central nervous system we call them pathways. So it's just bundles of axons on their way somewhere, and they travel in between the nuclei in the brain. So we divide the axons into three different types, basically. And again, this just has some heuristic value. This is just useful for us as neuroscientists. So the first kind of pathway that we segregate axons into or classify them into are called association pathways. And this is an old term again, but an association pathway is just a pathway or a collection of axons that connects different parts of the cortex in the same hemisphere. So remember, we have two hemispheres like this, and we have all of this cortex. This is all gray matter. This is all made up of individual areas. That's why they're different colored here. But now I want you to think about this. Some are motor, some are visual, and we'll learn that they're all something. But they all have to be connected to each other within one hemisphere, or my motor cortex wouldn't know what I'm looking at. So what we have are axons which connect all of the different areas of the cortex, and these are called association pathways. I'm going to give one example of an association pathway. There are many of them, by the way. Right above this area, right here, is a cortical area that I'm using my finger to show you. This is a cortical area, so this is where neurons are located. The axons of those neurons make up an association pathway called the girdle or the cingulum. So the gyrus, or the area of the cortex itself, is called the cingulate gyrus. And the axons come out of those neurons, and they're going to connect different areas of the cortex with each other. And you see that this is colored differently, and those different colors reflect that maybe there's different functional systems involved in this, but overall their function is to connect things within a single hemisphere. So association axons run in this plane. There's two hemispheres. They run in this plane and connect all of the areas of the cortex. Our next type of way that we classify axons in the nervous system are commissural pathways. And these are pathways that are going to connect one hemisphere with the other hemisphere. So this is easy to understand why we want to do this. Obviously, well, it doesn't take much to show this. I can move this hand, I can move this hand, I can move them both together. And so for me to make the same movement with both motor cortices requires that the planning of this movement, the initiation of the movement, and the execution of the movement somehow be coordinated. And it turns out that the largest fiber pathway in man is a structure called the corpus callosum, and the corpus callosum connects what we say homotopic parts in one hemisphere with parts in the other hemisphere. And homotopic means same. So the corpus callosum connects this area here, which is motor cortex, with the same area of motor cortex in the other hemisphere. And so each of these areas is connected to the other hemisphere via the corpus callosum. What I have shown on this is you're looking at a dorsal view. So if you leaned down and looked at the top of the brain, and then you used your hands to spread the two hemispheres apart in a real brain, what you would see here is that this entire structure is the corpus callosum. It's the largest fiber pathway in man. It's made up of 300 million axons connecting the cortex in one hemisphere with the cortex of the other hemisphere. So it is just a massive structure. Now let's imagine that we cut down the middle of this brain, so the neck's going to look much more like this medial view of our brain on our model. Let's look what the corpus callosum would look like. This is one of the things all neuroanatomists have to do. They have to be able to imagine all these structures in 3 dimensions. So if we cut through that corpus callosum, now remember, the axons are running in this plane. They're running in this plane, connecting this with this, this with this. So they're running like this. If we cut the corpus callosum and now look from the side, we see that in fact it's this huge bundle of axons here. If we were to stain a section through here with a Weigert stain, this structure would be huge and black and dark because they're all myelinated axons. So if I look here on my brain model, this is the corpus callosum right here, right beneath one of those association areas. You notice the corpus callosum. Here it's yellow, orange, darker orange, red, brown, blue, green. All those colors reflect. Notice the cortical areas. This one's connected through there to the other side. This one through there to the other side. So these travel in this plane. The last type of way that we classify axons is by calling them projection pathways. And actually, projection pathways are what most of all the axons in the brain are made up of. And to understand what projection pathways are, they're the axons that leave nuclei and go some other place to connect the various nuclei that are in these various systems. So we just call them projection nuclei or projection axons. So we define projects too, and we can use this term in terms of a nucleus or the axons, but right now we want to define projection pathways, so these would be the axons. Projects to means connected with. So most of these projection pathways run in this plane in the brain. So it's the cortex wanting to make something happen and having to have its axons go down to make it happen, or it's sensory information coming in either from the eye to the geniculate or from our skin, going up to the cortex so that we can have a percept of it or to have a subjective experience of it. So the axons running in this plane are the projection axons. So let me give you one example of a projection axon. And what I've done here is I've just complicated our little generic neuron and shown it as part of a pathway. So let's imagine that our generic neuron is a neuron located in the motor cortex. And those neurons are called pyramidal neurons. We'll learn about that when we talk about the motor system. But let's imagine that this is a neuron, and of course there'd be hundreds of them, but we have only drawn one. Here's a neuron. It's going to get its input from areas of the cortex that plan the motor movement. And then if this neuron fires, as we say that it fires an action potential here at the axon hillock. That potential is going to travel down this axon, and I want you to imagine, here's my motor cortex. This axon is traveling down in between nuclei in the brain, down through the midbrain, down through the pons, and now in the lower part of the medulla, it's going to cross the brain midline to enter the spinal cord on the other side of the body. And it's going to synapse onto neurons that are located in the spinal cord. So it's going to make a connection with the neurons that are located in the spinal cord. And those neurons are the neurons that will project their axons to the muscle. So these are projection axons. They project, we say, these are the words we use, these axons and the neurons project from motor cortex to the spinal cord. So that's a very important, basic, fundamental principle. It also explains something else we'll talk about in one of our later lectures, and that is why the motor cortex on this side of the brain controls the movement on that side of the body. And it's because the projection axons cross the midline to enter the spinal cord on the opposite side. So the movement is initiated here, but the movement takes place on the other side. So we have these cross projections. So these are the projection axons in the brain. So to review this again, let's look at this. We need to have a way that all the neurons in the brain know what all the other neurons are doing so that we can have normal behavior. Within each hemisphere, we have axons that connect the various nuclear groups of the various areas of the cortex in this plane. One hemisphere also needs to know what the other hemisphere is doing. So we have axons that go in this plane. Different neurons in the cortex project across this way to the other hemisphere. And last of all, we need to have a way that our axons communicate so that we have behavior, so that we can think, so that we do see, so that we can reach out and touch something. And these are primarily axons that run up and down in this plane. So when you cut up the brain and look and you see just black areas, it's axons, but you have no idea where they came from. So this is what millions of dollars of the American taxpayers' money and millions of hours of work, neuroscientists have been trying to trace these individual pathways, these individual structures of the brain in order to understand them. Now, the last thing we need to talk about is that we also call pathways in the brain in a particular way, or at least most of them, and this is really very helpful. And that is the first term in a pathway, and over here, this says decussation of the cortical spinal tract. Decussation means crossing, so this is where those axons cross in the brain. But this pathway, this projection pathway, is called the cortical spinal tract. The first term, cortical, means where the cell body of origin is located, and the second term, spinal, means where the axon ends, and it ends in the spinal cord. So, for example, for the eye, it would be different. We call that the retinogeniculate pathway. The retina is where the cell bodies of origin are located, and the geniculate nucleus is where the axons from the retina or the eye will end. So this is how we talk about the nervous system and how we identify the projection pathways. And that's very convenient. They're not all that way, but most of them are. Now, I'd like to end this lecture by briefly making a comment. A friend of mine who is an engineer recommended this as a wonderful example. This is a circuit board, and we've grown up in an era where we have computers and we have high-definition TVs and everything. So this doesn't seem mysterious to us. This doesn't seem like magic. But I want you to think about what it would be like, and my friend thought about this since he's an engineer, if I was to just take this board and go to him and give it to him and say, Philip, I want to know what this board does and how it does it. And I've lost the instruction manual, I've lost the blueprints, and in fact, I don't even know what instrument this thing was taken out of. So what I would be asking him to do is to reverse engineer this board. And in order to do that, it would require a number of things. So, for example, he would groan, first of all, and tell me he didn't want to do it, but he'd believe I lost the instruction booklet. He would want to determine how the different components are connected to each other. He would also want to know what each of the components do. Now, he'd be looking that up in a book. You know, there's a little number on each of these components. He'd look it up in a book, and it would tell him what this component does. Well, you already see the analogy with the brain, don't you? Okay? All of the components in our brain are connected to each other. the axons, and they all have a specific function. These would be the nuclei and what they do. But we don't have any blueprint. We don't have any of these things to do with the brain. This is why all these early techniques and everything were developed, so that we could even identify where the nuclear groups were at, or identify where the axons went, and now to understand what the function is. And if we still have a little bit of difficulty in appreciating the extent of the challenge that faces modern neuroscience, we only have to think about this. This circuit board only has about 20 components on it. There are 100 billion neurons in the adult human brain, and there are estimated to be 100 trillion connections between them. Each of these areas has a different function. We have no blueprint to tell us, and that's what neuroscience is about. It's about determining the nuclear groups, the connections between them, and the function. And is it amazing that any of us ever has any normal behavior? Thank you.